Good afternoon. We're speaking with Mitch Payne at Diversity D Irrigation. He's the general manager and has roughly 15 years of irrigation experience with them. And he's going to be talking to us about some of the irrigation components and practices within agricultural irrigation. Mitch, in your experience, would you agree that there's a certain scenario for both pivot and drip applications?
Absolutely. I don't think that drip is for every single farm out there, and I don't think that drip is for every single customer out there. It has its benefits, and it also could have its flaws. To go into detail with something like that, in the meaning of field size and field shape and terrain of a field obviously dictates what we can irrigate with drip or not irrigate with drip. If I had a customer that we were looking at a farm that the drip just didn't seem feasible to put in, I'll probably steer him towards a pivot. And maybe it didn't fit because of economic side of it. If our terrain is terrible and could push us to use different products to make it work that are costly, may steer that farmer away on the economic side of it, where it would be better just to go ahead and put a pivot on there for the economic side. And then, I said drip is not for every person because when you have drip, it's a little more intensive managing versus just turning on a pivot and letting it go in a circle and watering. Sometimes drip takes more management to be more successful at the end of the day, and some farmers, not to say they can't do it, but you get some guys that farm so many acres and they, what I say, paint with a big brush, and they don't have the time or nor can take the time to manage the drip to meet higher expectations. And so there's not very many of those out there, but I do run into those guys occasionally where I'll say, hey, drip's not for you, let's put a pivot on here.
Yeah, it might be a little more difficult because it's not necessarily visible to the naked eye.
Sure.
And so you have to,
ultimately I try to create relationships with these guys and get to know their livelihood, because when we sell them drip or sell them a pivot, we're messing with their livelihood day in and day out. And so I create relationships with them so that they can trust me and feel comfortable doing business with either myself or somebody here at Diversity D. And you can pick up on that, especially after 15 years of doing it. I can pretty much be with a guy for a while and kind of figure out how he farms and how he manages, and I'll try to meet his expectations one way or another, knowing that.
Sure, yeah. And having several thousand acres of drip versus a pivot can be night and day difference. I mean, you're spending a lot more time watching that drip than you would, for instance, a pivot.
For sure. At the end of the day, if they're installing drip and replacing their pivots, I mean, they're doing it for a financial purpose. I mean, they're looking at getting more yield out of their crop and trying to use the best, most efficient way to irrigate today to achieve that. The water these guys are using is declined considerably over the years, and so with commodity prices not increasing like everything else increases in today's world, these guys are all about making pounds, and so they're looking at ways to integrate into something that's the best out there on the market. And 90% of the time it's drip that's going to be the best application for those guys to grow those kind of yields.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned yields, there are some differences in yield comparisons between drip and, say, a pivot, for example.
Sure. Common practice today is we compete against a pivot. We've pretty much got rid of the row water application. That's kind of ancient times of row watering, because we just waste so much water when we row water. Now there's still markets that they still row water, but as as a whole, pivots is more of our competition for drip. And, you know, in our country, these pivots may have a 300 or 400 gallon minute pivot package, which is low for a pivot. I mean, the amount of acreage that they can cover and the yield that they get out of a 300 gallon minute pivot package, they just can't get the pounds on those farms. And so we can go in with drip and use the same amount of water, and maybe we're not covering as many acres as they were with the pivot, but we're making more yield on that application. So if I was to give you an example, if we did do the whole machine and different, not different, but the same amount of water applied through the drip as the pivot, in most cases in this country we see a bale better to the acre of cotton. Mm-hmm. And people are increasing that with fertility. People are learning more and more about fertility, that it's not just water that makes the yield increase, it's a whole package.
Tillage practices.
Fertilizer, NPK.
Sure.
It all makes the difference to make the bigger yields.
Absolutely. Now, some of those guys that you're saying might still row water some. They might be on 80s. They may have a subsurface drip system, but they might have 80-inch spacing, and so they're using row water to help germinate that seed.
Sure.
And is that effective? I mean, does that...
Well, years ago when drip come in this country was probably in the middle 70s in West Texas, and not a whole lot was put in the 70s, obviously, but the acres that were put in was a every other row application. So if they were on 40s, they were installing it on 80s. If they were on 30s, they were installing it on 60s. And economics played a role in that because, you know, it's about 30% less money to put it in on 80s than it is on 40s. And, you know, the weather and the climate has changed over the years where, you know, we don't see our average rainfall like we used to consistently throughout the years. And so if a guy was on 80s and he was trying to water it up, well, he couldn't water it up with the drip system, so he had to lay out his poly pipe and string it out so he could germinate that seed. And over the years, that trend has changed because of the climate, and more guys are putting it in on solid row, I'll call it, because you never know if they're farming on 30s or 36s or 38s or 40s, whatever they may be. They're putting it under every cotton row or every row, not necessarily cotton. They could be growing corn or soybeans or milo or whatever it may be. And so what that's doing is just helping them ensure that they can get the moisture to the top to be able to germinate. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen, and my customers have seen it as well, that it just took 1 year not to get a crop up to pay for the difference between the 40-inch and the 80s to the 40s application. So the trend has changed. You know, today we're probably doing 85 or 90% on solid row, and the rest is skip row. Mm-hmm. Whereas 10 years ago or 12 years ago, it was just the opposite. It was 85 or 90% 80s and the rest solid row.
And that was like a climatic shift that probably drove that difference.
Definitely due to rain. And then you take a drip system where if they have a 100-acre block and they got 300 gallons a minute, well, hell, if they went to row water that thing at 300 gallons a minute on 100 acres, you know, a lot of people say it took 10 gallons a minute per acre to row water. Mm-hmm. Well, hell, that's only 3 gallons a minute per acre. Yeah. And so
it's impossible.
It's not impossible, but they would have to start in February to get enough moisture to plant it in May. Yeah. And so it wasn't feasible for them to do that either.
Sure.
And so that trend has changed. A lot of guys are changing up how they plant. That's just happened in the last 4 or 5 years. If they have 80s, they're not planting on 40-inch rows. They're trying to move and plant a 30-50 pattern where they're trying to get that seed bed closer to the dripper line where they can help push that water up to try to plant into moisture to germinate.
Mm-hmm. And so in your experience, the input costs versus returns on a drip system, like how long would it take a grower to repay that system or to pay that system off?
Well, you know, I'm going to use a rule of thumb because Mother Nature can sure enough play a factor into that. Mm-hmm. I had a customer that put some drip in about 8 years ago and got hailed out the first 2 years. Well, his return on his investment just lengthened because he wasn't able to grow a crop. Now, obviously, he got paid on insurance, but insurance didn't cover as much as it could have potentially covered it, 4-bale cotton, if you will. But as a rule of thumb, you're looking at a payoff on 3 to 5 years, and that's out of pocket. So if a customer does not get government assistance, which has been huge for this drip industry in this country for 15 years, just a subsidized program that was paying the customers to convert something over that was less efficient irrigating to something that was more efficient. And the government was strong on that, and they still are today. And either replacing, as far as going back to some side rolls, they'll replace that before they replace a pivot, just because the efficiency of that side roll is way less than that pivot, or way less efficient than that pivot is. And then it'll go to row water. Something that's row watered versus a pivot is going to be funded before that pivot gets funded. And then it just kind of works up the chain on how the efficiency rolls in that practice that they're using.
So there's kind of tiers.
There's tiers
as far as how that
Absolutely.
money gets guided.
Absolutely. So when a project gets funded by the government, well, they may be paying 40% of that or 50% of that system. Well, it makes it a little easier to pay it off sooner than 5 years. I've had customers that paid off first year just with yield increase and getting subsidized from the government.
Wow.
But some of these landlords will pay for it out of their, I call it Hip National Bank, and it doesn't give any help from the government. It'll take them probably 5 years to pay that off.
And that's a pretty realistic
That's
number.
a very realistic number. Even if it took, even if they had some tough years in there and it took 7 years to pay it off. Well, these landlords can't go invest their money into a bank and get a return on their money in 7 years. And that's the way a lot of my farmers approach landlords about transitioning over and putting drip under something that can make them more money. Not only will it make them more money in yield, it increases the value of that land with that drip system underneath it. So it's a win-win situation, if you will, for a landlord to improvise and put some better technology out on his field, not only for yield purposes, but for future down the road on selling that land if he had to.
Is there a number of growers that will take a farm and do subsurface drip in phases? I mean, will they do 100 acres this year and then add on to it and do another 100 acres in 2 years?
Sure.
Or so?
Yeah, so, before the program come out, the government program, most of these guys were paying it out of their pocket, right? Well, it was like buying the farm again, maybe doubling buying the farm again.
Remortgaging a home.
Absolutely. They may have bought that land for $300 an acre, and it was costing them $800 an acre to put the drip in 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard for somebody to say, I didn't even pay that much for the land, you want me to put this on an irrigation system.
Yeah.
But, they said, okay, here's what we'll do. Let's do it in phases. Let's do 50 acres. And let's put this 50 acres of drip in and then start recouping some money off of it where it can pay for the next 50 acres. And so a lot of farmers still do that today. I think, we've got half a dozen projects booked for this coming season that are add-ons.
Yeah.
It's from a grower just spending enough money that he had the cash for, and then getting some residual from that, and then adding on to it in the future.
Okay. And can you get some government assistance if you kind of have a future plan to expand on systems?
Sure. So
will they work with you?
They will work
like
with you.
that?
Today, the government policies and rules have changed over the years, and one is the government does not want to put anything into irrigation that has never been irrigated. I mean, they're trying to conserve water, and that's their game. That's the name of their game. Is, hey, we're trying to conserve water and not trying to break out any more land and water that, because as I said earlier, our water continues to decline. It's not getting any better.
Yeah.
And so the government's looking out and saying, hey, let's make this water last as long as we can make it last by utilizing the acres that we're putting it on.
Yeah, so you don't want, until they can get the land that's being farmed currently under control, they don't want to start breaking out new land and trying to irrigate more land.
Sure. Years ago that happened. So let's say a farmer come to me and had a pivot on there, and then he was watering 125 acres underneath that circle. Well, he had those dryland corners that he just was planting dryland on.
Mhm.
Well, let's say he had 600 gallons a minute. Well, back then 600 gallons a minute was still great water.
Mhm.
So in his eyes, he's like, hey, you know what? I can put this whole 160 acres in drip now, and I can make more yield on the corners. That essentially, economics says that the corners will pay for everything else over time, which is 100% right. You take a dryland corner that's making a half a bale a year, and then you turn around making 4 bales, and you got 4 of those corners doing that. So you got 28 acres that are now producing you 4 times the yield that you were making prior.
Yeah.
So farmers were jumping all over that. Well, the government says, if I'm going to help you pay for this drip system, you're only going to be able to irrigate what you've been certified, which is 125 acres
Underneath the pivot.
underneath the pivot.
Yeah.
Now they'll let them kind of square a field up in a way, if you will,
Mhm.
and say, because it's more costly to do a drip system in a circle than it is square. You've
Sure.
got more trench, you've got more pipe, you've got more labor. It just overall adds more expense. Well, they're saying, okay, we'll let you take 10% of those acres that were dry land and utilize it to square up your farm. And so at the end of the day, they could still only put in 125 acres of drip, but they could square that up and start it on one side of the field or the other to help them square that up. And then the rest of those acres, they had to either put into a grass program or not irrigated. And it was just dry land again.
Could it be worked into an add-on?
No,
later?
because 125 acres is all they've been certified.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the rule is if you've had to have watered the last two out of the last 5 years to qualify for that.
Okay.
So basically, it's a 5-year history, and all you've had to have is 2 of those years, any of those 5, to qualify to be certified irrigated.
Okay.
But all honesty, in this country, and you go further north and get out of our market, those guys still have good water, and they can still take a. It makes sense for a grower not to use equip money, and let's say he's up in Kansas and he's still got 600 gallons a minute of water or 800 gallons a minute of water that he wants to water now that whole quarter. Well, he can do that, not get government assistance, and then pay for it with the extra acres that are under drip that I talked about just a minute ago.
Mm-hmm.
So you still see some of that, but in our country, south of Amarillo, the water's just depleted so much that they don't even have enough water to water a pivot.
Sure. And there's a minimum gallon per acre
Mm-hmm. The government requires 3 gallons a minute per acre.
to receive assistance for subsurface.
That's correct.
Is there a difference in the minimum for if they were going to put a pivot on?
I think 3 gallons a minute is the same.
That's
I think that's across the board the same.
Okay. And so, got all that. Your product. You obviously are a dealer for Netafim irrigation products. Do you feel that your product may be superior to others?
I feel like Netafim has got a superior product. Diversity D started in 1994, and I think in 97, they actually became a certified Netafim dealer. And so for what we know here is Netafim, and we've always dealt with Netafim, and they've been good to us. Netafim originated in Israel in 1967, and it was farmers that basically built Netafim. They were farmers in Israel that utilized the technology of drip. And so before they moved to the States, and then the Californians when they come out in the early 70s, Netafim did everything. I mean, it was Netafim, but they were the designers, they were the installers, they were the salesmen, they were everything that we are today, basically Diversity D is. And so they created a partnership with dealers in the same sense of, hey, we're not just selling you product, we've been down this road of farming to utilize it in our farming practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think at the end of the day, there's other products out there that are probably just as superior. I don't know that, but I think what any guy would want, including our customers, the support behind what you sell them.
Sure.
And so every manufacturer is going to have trouble. I don't care. You're making a product. Somebody's going to have trouble. And I think at the end of the day, it's how that trouble and problem is taken care of through the manufacturer. And in my dealings with them and the owner's dealings with them, that anytime we've had a problem, they always stood behind their problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I could take a Netafim guy, I know multiple of them, that I could take a Netafim guy and go let him meet my customer and wouldn't be a bit scared of that.
Yeah.
Because they want to create that relationship, not only with us as the dealer, but as to our end user as well.
Yeah. And it's probably a similar deal. Like, you know, you have growers who are coming to you for y'all's warranty on like workmanship,
Mhm.
for instance, which is
1 year.
1 year workmanship warranty, and they have a good relationship with you, and they can confidently come to address that issue or situation with,
Sure.
with your product. And then you, in turn, if that ends up being a Netafim issue, not a workmanship issue, you can easily go to your product provider and get the problem solved.
Yeah, say, hey, we
So-
got a problem, and we'll start the process of why it happened, where it happened, and
Yeah.
then what we're going to do to resolve it.
Absolutely. So y'all get to play. Y'all are probably in a pretty tough position, being a middleman between the product side and the consumer side.
Sure.
Y'all probably have to deal with a lot of phone calls, I imagine.
We do, and it's like I said, if you're manufacturing a product, you're going to have trouble. It's not a matter of if, it's when, and then it's determined to the supplier and the dealer on how that's corrected.
Sure.
And I think Netafim does a great job at it, and we, Diversity D, try to do a great job at that as well, to make our customer feel confident and trust us to make sure that we give him the best system that we can give him, and if there is trouble, take care of it the best that we can all take care of it.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any examples of maybe some of their warranty on some of their products?
Yeah, so their extruded product, I guess they, in a sense, have two different products they extrude, which is a thin wall dripper line that we bury in the subsurface drip irrigation, and then they have a heavy wall, which is more for your above ground application, as if it was in a grape vineyard or a orchard or something like that, where it's going to be exposed on top of the ground with sunlight exposure,
More elements.
people involved with it, and the subsurface drip has a 5-year manufacturer warranty, and the heavy wall dripper line has a 7-year warranty. Flow meters, they have like a 3-year warranty on their flow meters. Filters, I think, are a 5-year warranty on their filters. You know, Netafim has multiple lines of product with different warranties on those. But I've seen it where there was products that failed after, like let's say a dripper line that failed after 5 years. And maybe it had a problem from the beginning, but it wasn't really brought to anybody's attention.
Mm-hmm.
And then, let's say year 6 we're into it, and we find out that we're having some, I don't know, I'll use an example as squirting drippers.
Mm-hmm.
That's happened, and it's not common, but it's happened. And it was a weld issue during the extruding process of that. Well, you know, you get enough samples dug up and you get the quality control involved, they've replaced a field like that before. And even though it was after the 5-year standard warranty, you know, I believe that's how Netafim is they want to stand behind their product 100%. Sure. And if they realize that they got a problem, they're going to fix it.
They're not opposed to admitting a fault.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Now, just like anybody in the industry, immediately they've got to diagnose it hard enough to be able to find out that it is a manufacturing problem.
Yeah.
And so there's steps and corporate stuff that you just got to go through the hoops to finally get to the bottom end of it.
Yeah.
But you know, anything that's ever been their problem, they've stood behind.
Yeah.
And there's some things that's been their problem that they stood behind that they didn't have to stand behind.
Yeah.
And so, again, that goes back to the loyal that we have and how loyal they are to us as a manufacturer, to a dealer, to the end user.
Yeah. And you touched on vineyards a little bit. That's becoming pretty prevalent in y'all's area, Brownfield. Have y'all done some installations on vineyards?
Yeah, so I think this is going to go back to some of that depleting water in our country that these guys in Terry County, especially, Terry County is the grape capital of Texas, I think is what they call it.
Yes, sir.
And more and more of these growers are trying to branch out to something, some crop that can still make them good money that maybe doesn't take as much water. And so you see a lot of these growers that will take a pivot that they're not watering anymore and put it 60 acres of grapes or 30 acres of grapes or 10 acres of grapes. Hell, they may start out with 5 acres of grapes because grapes are so expensive to put in from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it doesn't take as much water. And these guys here, I think there's 4,000 acres, I think, in Terry County is how much grapes there are here.
Yeah, if not more.
4,000 to 6,000. I
Yeah.
can't remember the number, but it's somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And so, honestly, there's only one way that you can water grapes, and that's drip.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't run a pivot across it, right? Because you'll
Mhm.
tear up your trellis and your line wires and the whole 9 yards.
Sure.
You could run solid set, but then if they didn't have enough water to water with a pivot and they're going to something else more efficient, well, they ran out of water to go to solid set because it takes so much water to coming out those tips on a sprinkler.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of out of the woods. So really their ultimate end game for a vineyard is to put drip on it. Now, some have put subsurface drip in and then some have hung it on the trellis.
Mm-hmm.
If you bury it, you have to, when you plant grapes first, you have to get water to that root soon.
Yeah.
So you've got to have actually a two-step application if you're going to bury it. You got to plant a dripper line right underneath the row the first year, and then that'll usually last them about 3 years, maybe 5. And then what they'll do is they'll move out and put the dripper line in between the rows.
And abandon
that one that was underneath the row. The reason why they have to abandon it is because a grape root is just like a tree root.
Mm-hmm.
It grows big and it grows vigorously. Well, if you got that dripper line right underneath there, it's going to eventually plug it up.
Yeah.
There's not enough. If it's not going to plug the drippers up with the roots, it's going to plug it up by kinking it, by the roots growing around the dripper line
Pinch
it off.
Yeah.
So, used to, I'd say, I don't know how long we've been doing grapes now, probably 6 or 7 years, I'm going to guess. That was probably the number one application was burying it.
Mm-hmm.
And now that transition has changed, just I think because of the hassle of
A little more simple to have it above ground.
a little bit more
Can
simple.
Work on it.
Guys can see it.
See it.
Makes them feel better. They can see it.
Yes, sir.
So yeah, that's. I think that's going to be a market that continues to grow for us, and I think you're going to see more wineries being built in this country and somewhere to go with the juice. And we have our climate and our soil type here in Terry County is great for grapes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just we have a caliche bottom that allows that water to drain out, where we don't have disease pressure, we don't have too much fungus pressure.
Mm-hmm.
It's just ideal for grapes in this country.
Well draining,
Well
topsoil.
drained, yeah. Whereas you go down south in the hill country, there's a lot of grapes down there, but their climate's more humid. It rains a lot more. The soils are dark, so they contend with a lot of disease and fungus on the grapes throughout the year. So essentially, it costs them more money to grow them because they have to spend so much more time